everybody. Welcome to the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have for you a special guest. As always, his name is Mark Morales, and he is an inker extraordinaire. I love when we get to have inkers on because, in some respects, they are kind of the unsung heroes of comic book work. The writers, pencilers get all the glory, but the inkers do as much as anyone to really get the feel of the book, really get the vision of the penciler across, and make that finished book that we all get to enjoy. So we talk about Mark's career, how he got into comics, illustrating, inking, all the places he's been. He's been including Image, Dark Horse, Chaos, DC, Marvel, a lot of stuff in Marvel. And yeah, just get into his process and everything about the Morales career. So, without further ado, this is Mark Morales. Today, we are thrilled to have artist, inker Mark Morales on the program. Mark, how you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for coming on the show. We're gonna
Thank you
kick
for
off
having me.
things with the same question we ask all our guests, which is, how did you first discover comic books?
Okay, let's see. I was born in like the early 70s, like 69, 70. So comics back then were like a quarter each. Um, so the youngest of three kids, and my sister and brother are much older. So my brother's like 13 years older. So he was like a camp counselor. And when I was like 5 or 6 years old, my parents drove up there to pick him up from the camp and take him back home. And they put me in the corner with a bunch of comic books, which I had never seen before. I've been reading the newspaper comic strips, and I guess I taught myself how to read from there. They told me, reading Peanuts and all that stuff, but I'd never seen an actual comic book. I see maybe Spider-Man was on the Electric Company, but I'd not seen a comic book. So they put me in front of a stack of them, and I picked up this one with it was I know the exact issue. It was Marvel Premiere number 23 with Iron Fist and the Warhawk. And I was like, what is this? This is magical. It's like he's punching this big dude in the cover with the Iron Fist, and just blown away by it. So I was like, okay, I need to find out more about this. So I asked them on the way back home, it's like, where do you get more of these things? And they're like, oh, well, you can pick them up at the store. It's like, I didn't know. No one told me. So we were living in Long Island, New York at the time, which is like a suburb of New York City. So it was like maybe a 45-minute ride. And my father worked in the city. So every Friday he would take $1, the comic books were a quarter back then, and just pick up 4 random comic books and bring them home. So started reading them then. And I quickly realized that it was like a whole continuing story that I was just becoming part of knowing now. You know, it's like back then Marvel was reprinting a lot of old books, like Marvel Triple Action reprinted old Avengers issues, and I forgot the other one that reprinted old. I think it was Amazing Adventures that reprinted old X-Men issues. And so he'd pick up a new issue of the Avengers by George Perez, but then there'd be an old issue by Jack Kirby, and I'm like, what happened here? So it made me realize that there was a whole tapestry going on there before I was even aware. So it set up the back issue collecting bug, and I was lost from there.
We always like to ask if, the collecting gene sort of started off when you first started reading, and it sounds like it did for you.
It did because, like I said, my father was just randomly picking up stuff every week. So it was like every week I got like another puzzle piece, but I didn't quite get the whole thing. And this is like maybe in like the mid 70s. So there was really no comic book stores near me. So every bit of information, I was like, oh, okay, this connects to this somehow. Like, Magneto's the Scarlet Witch's father? How's that? All that sort of stuff. And it really kept going, and the collecting bug at least. And once I started going to conventions, probably in the early 80s, that's when I started filling in all the gaps with the collection and whatnot.
Do you have those earliest, four for $1 issues that your dad brought you?
I still have some of them. I mean, I had to, the Iron Fist issue, which I took from the camp, I had to get another copy of that. I read to the point where it was literally disintegrating. But yeah.
That's a sign of a real comic fan. You have to have at least
Exactly.
one or two, or maybe
Gotta
a
have the real
dozen.
copy, man. Yeah.
Yeah, disintegrating books. Okay, so started out big comic fan, started by your dad, then started filling in, these back issues, going to conventions. When did you start thinking about doing this more professionally, or even just start doing art based on, your love of comics?
Well, the starting doing art started pretty much right around the time I picked up the comic book, the first one, because I guess I was maybe trying to draw stuff from the newspaper strips that I was reading. And once I got the comic books, and it was like, oh, they're superheroes, okay. So I would at some point, like one Christmas, I think it was maybe it's like 8 or 9. My father got the Origins of Marvel Comics, the hardcover book. Was
Right.
they reprinted all the stuff from the origins of all those characters, and I remember just getting a tracing paper and just tracing over the drawings over and over again. And eventually, there were a couple of kids in my neighborhood that were into comic books too. So we like started a little comic book thing where one would write it, one would draw it, I would draw it, and then other ones would ink and color it, and just sort of started getting into it that way. Never, I guess the thought of doing it as a career didn't really hit me until maybe I was like 14 or 15, and I went to a convention in New York City. Every Thanksgiving weekend they had it was called a creation convention. They would bring in, at the time, most of the talent lived in New York. So those conventions had a huge, just tons of artists out there. So I would go there to pick up, back issues or whatever, but you could talk to the artist and see the work that they were doing. Like I met Frank Miller there when he's doing Daredevil, and a bunch of guys. Joe Rubenstein I met there too. It was like selling Wolverine pages. Which I should have bought because they're very expensive now. But I was there for comic books.
Yep.
Yeah, but so I got to see that these guys were doing it for a living. It was like a career. But I don't know if I ever really thought of it as a career until like maybe high school.
Yeah. And so you're getting, starting to get this inkling that you can actually do this for a career. So what does that look like? Your sort of transition from interest and, education to, I'm going to start, I'm going to make a go for it.
Right. So let's see. High school, I pretty much stopped drawing for a couple of years, between maybe my sophomore and junior year. I was like, running track. I was like, interested in girls and they weren't interested in me and all this sort of stuff. So I really wasn't really paying attention too much to comic books. And then to remember my junior year, it's like, okay, you have to start figuring out what you're going to do for college. Since college is, it's an option for my family, luckily. So it was either going into art or going into like psychiatry or psychology. That fascinated me like that. But I didn't think I would have it in me to go to school for like 8 years to study anything else. So I figured I'll give the art thing a try. So got together a portfolio and applied to a few different places. Like I said, I lived in Long Island, so it's like maybe 45 minutes from New York City. So it was easy enough to apply to the ones in New York, like School of Visual Arts and Pratt. And I sent a couple of ones out to like places in California too. Got accepted and ended up going to the School of Visual Arts, which is it started as a cartoonist school back in the 50s. That was the school where like Steve Ditko and Wally Wood and all those guys went to originally. And then it became like a full art school instead of a cartoonist school. And when I went there, I had teachers like Will Eisner, Gene Colan, Harvey Kurtzman, Joe Orlando. I guess Carmine Infantino was teaching there a bit. So did my time there. And I did my first, professional job for Will, actually, on re-inking an old Spirit story that he had lost in a fire or something. And but that was not my main focus. I went there for like I still was hedging my bets. I did comic book stuff, but I also did animation stuff too and illustration because I didn't know exactly what would be the career path. So when I got out of school, I did animation for like maybe a year and a half and truly hated it. The place I was at least. And then I did like clothing design, like for kids, like, design t-shirts and stuff for kids, and didn't love that either. And started getting my portfolio together. Was like, okay, let me get the comic book thing an actual legitimate try now. Got my portfolio together and went to a bunch of conventions and got hired. Doing I guess my first thing that anyone would have noticed was like back in the 90s when they were doing the Bad Girls boom. I did Evil Ernie for Chaos Comics. Evil Ernie and Lady Death stuff. And
was that full illustration, or were you inking at that point, or doing both?
I was mostly inking because I figured out early enough that I can draw pretty well. I think, like I said, I did animation and stuff, so I can draw. But to do it to make a living, penciling would be death for me because it takes me like 2 or 3 days to draw a page, and that I would like at least. And you cannot eat or live in New York City on that. So I figured the inking thing goes quicker, so I can do that, and then I'll get my way in there, and then I'll figure out the penciling thing later. So, and I've been inking mostly, so there you go.
Yeah.
I plan to not work 100%.
Well, it did in terms of the first part, at least, because
Yes.
I feel like we hear this similar story from a lot of other inkers, which is, I can pencil, I can do it. It's going to take a lot longer, and I'm not going to be able to,
Eat.
knock through some stuff and eat and make a
Right.
living here.
It's truly one of the hardest jobs in art, actually, because if you're a penciler that you're any good, at least you have to be able to draw everything convincingly, tell a story convincingly, be able to tell a story at a people at a coffee shop and Captain America punching Thanos in the face. You have to be able to do all that really well if you're going to be good at it. It's a tough job.
Yeah. And did you learn about the sort of art of inking while you were at the School of Visual Arts, or anything that you can bring forward? Or was it more you learn the discipline of inking by learning illustration and figuring out, where to apply, emphasis and things of that sort?
It's a bit of both. Like I said, I did all the illustration and stuff, but I also like had Will Eisner and Gene Colan as teachers, and Will would sit there. It's like, oh, here's a brush. Here's how to use a brush.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And you figure it out as you're going along and getting tips from other people in class and teachers or whatever. I think for inking, at least when I was doing my clothing design job, I did some backgrounds. A friend of mine that I went to college with had a lead on a job, like another inker was looking for a background assistant. So he couldn't do it at the time. So he told me about it, and I went over, and it was Joe Rubenstein, who I met years before the convention. And at the time, Joe was inking pretty much all of Marvel books, everything over there. So he was doing like 3 or 4 books a month. So we needed some assistance. And I was there for maybe 8 months to a year, I guess, on and off. And working with him was really like a master class in it because he's a great inker and was able to see sort of really more how to approach the day of doing it, how the business of it works, how sit there and how you got to figure out how to allocate your time to make it work and make the deadlines and all that sort of stuff, and just like tips and techniques. So that was like the graduate school for inking right there. And pretty much after that is when I got the job at Chaos and moved on from there.
And when you started getting, professional work, what was, did you have, was it basically whatever assignments came your way? I would imagine in the beginning, but were there certain things you wanted to work on beyond, what you were working on? So you started Evil Ernie.
Well, sure. You want to work on the stuff you grew up reading. You want to work on the X-Men or the Avengers or whatever. So, but you got to build your way up to it, because when I first started, look back at the stuff I was doing back then, and I was okay, but you have to work yourself to be good enough to get to, where you want to be. So, I don't look back at the stuff with any regret because it was the best I could do at the time. And you could see the learning process. The first page of that series is not as good as the last page of the series. So there was actual progress.
Right.
So, and it didn't take too long after that because, after I did that job, I did some like short stories for like Dark Horse Presents and some other people. And then the work kind of dried up for like maybe 6 months. So I was like, okay, so I really need to get better at this. So it was like going into the summer that year, and there were a bunch of conventions. So I basically worked on my portfolio and got it to the point where it was bulletproof, where I could find nothing wrong with it. And went to, at the time, there was, I guess they still do the Chicago convention in Rosemont, which is not even Chicago, but outside of Chicago, and San Diego Comic-Con. So I got my portfolio together and flew to those conventions and basically showed my portfolio to everyone that even looked like they could hire me at Marvel, DC, Image at the time. And I got pretty good responses. I showed my stuff to this guy at Wildstorm, right? Jeff something, I forget his name. I don't think he's there anymore. And he loved my portfolio. I was actually trying to show it to Jim Lee, but Jim was, this is the height of the image boom, so Jim was off a million people. So he was
Right.
like, "Give me your your portfolio, your packet of pages that I inked, and I'll show it to Jim." So I give it to him happily, and I figure, okay, maybe I'll hear from him. Didn't hear from him, and a lot of freelancers will tell you, you go to a convention, you meet an editor or whatever, and they'll tell you that, oh, we want to hire you on this, and you never hear back from them because like convention talk.
Yeah.
So I figured that nothing was going to come of it. So I went to San Diego and entered at the time Top Cow, which is Mark Silvestri's branch of Image, was having a talent hunt. So I entered the talent hunt and I won that. And winning that means that you got hired by the company. They flew you up to Santa Monica. They put you up in an apartment, and basically for a month or two, you just train with them as it's like a paid intern, basically, to learn what you're doing. And then if it works out, you stay at the studio. So like, cool, that's great. I mean, Santa Monica's nice, and working at Top Cow. I got home and got a call from Jim Lee. Surprising. I was like, this can't be Jim Lee. I thought it was a joke. So I hung up, and then he called back. And what happened was in Chicago, when I had given his editor my portfolio, I neglected to staple my info onto it. So they had the pages, but they didn't have my name. So they couldn't figure out who it was until I showed it to them again in San Diego. And then they were like, okay. So they wanted me to come out to Wildstorm, it was weird with Image back then. They were like, it was a company, but it was like different kingdoms within the company that were competing for talent. So I had already accepted the Top Cow job. So, despite Jim wanting me to come out to Wildstorm, I decided to stay at Top Cow and went out there and basically flamed out of that after 2 or 3 months. So I was like, okay, maybe I should take the Wildstorm job. But before I left California and came back east, I got a job at Extreme Studios with Rob Liefeld, and they said basically you just do it at home. So I went back east, but I was still working for Image. So I was doing all the books. I was doing a lot of the Blood books, like Blood Strike and Blood this and Blood that, for like a year, which was a lot of fun. And then right after that is when a friend of mine from Long Island, Adam Polina, got onto X-Force, and they were looking for an inker for that. And it was right around the time that Image was sort of imploding, kind of like sales had started to drop.
Yeah.
So it was a perfect time for me to hop ship and go to work on the X book.
And then you sort of took it from there, I think, and that you kind of took off. You mentioned a number of publishers that you work for, and places like Image, all the different variations of Image, Dark Horse, Chaos, eventually Marvel, DC. Are there any, from your perspective or from the perspective of a freelancer, are there really any big differences that you can see, like culturally or even in, just sort of the style or tone of these books? Or are they really just kind of like all, just this is a gig here, this is a gig there, but they're basically similar?
It depends. I mean, back in when I first started, this was at Marvel, was probably, I think it was 96 maybe, or 96, I guess. And I lived in the city at that time. I was living maybe 5 blocks from the Marvel office. So, if when every week I would go into the office basically. And back then, before this was like maybe a decade before Disney bought them, it was really like, you read the old comic books like the bullpen, the Howler Marvel bullpen with John Romita Sr. there, and all the people working. And it was like that. You'd go there and it was basically shaped like a rectangle. All the offices were on the outside of it, and in the middle were all just a bunch of artist desks and the artists working on the books. Like the production guys that are like taking the pages and scanning them and cleaning them up or whatever. And a lot of times I would just go there and just sit down for the day instead of working at home in my studio alone. I go there just to be around people and work, and it was very energetic there because like you could walk in and like editors would pull you aside, like, you want to work on something right now for me, and just do it right there. Whereas the DC offices, like, I did some stuff for DC back then too. It was very much more corporate. It was like suit and tie type of stuff there. Whereas Marvel was like, we make comics here. It was like, So at that time there was certainly a bit more of a different culture. But I think over time, with so many people working, like I said, when I first started, you kind of had to be in New York area. But with the advent of FedEx and computers and you can scan stuff, you can work anywhere now. So it's not quite the same anymore, and this doesn't really. It kind of smooths out everything. Every company's kind of the same now. There's
Yeah.
not really much difference. I don't think.
Yeah. I totally hear that. And I think that goes with, a lot of work nowadays with especially with anybody that can do things remotely. It's sort of
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like one of the Star Wars books I was working on last year was like the writer's in England, the penciler's in Indonesia. I'm here. The letterer is in Australia, and I think the colorist was in Italy. So it's like that would never have even conceived of happening 20 years ago before the internet. Now you
yeah.
can just work anywhere. So it makes it easier in a way.
It brings up a good question about sort of communication, especially communication between an inker and a penciler. Maybe not explicit communication, but like, do you have to have sort of, I don't know, some in that collaboration, do you have to have some sort of communication in any way with the penciler, either explicit or just sort of like, I get what this person's going for here, and so there's a little bit of just
Right.
communication on the page.
I've been pretty, I think maybe weird with that, was lucky with that because like the first job I said, like I got with the Chaos Comics, I became friends with the penciler Stephen Hughes. Late Stephen Hughes, great, but I became friends with him, so we would discuss stuff. And with X Force, like I said, my friend Adam Polina got the book, and shortly after I got on it, he ended up buying a place in New York City, and I was his roommate for all intents and purposes. He bought a triplex, and I was living in the bottom floor. He was living in the top floor, so we had kind of a studio arrangement there. So obviously, we were discussing the pages as they were coming along. And it seems like with just about every job I've done, I've tried to, before even starting, call the penciler or email them or whatever, just to sort of pick their brain and see what they're looking for, so that we can be on the same page with it. Because you can't just intuit what they're looking for. You have to ask. You have
Yeah.
to ask. And anytime I work with somebody new, it's always like, okay, give me like 5 or 6 pages to work on it. I'll send them to you. I'll call you, and then we'll go over it and see what's working for you and what's not, and then we can hash it out. Because at the end of the day, like I said, they're the captain of the ship, and the way that the change that has been over the years in inking, at least, is the pencilers since I guess the early 90s or so, since they've gone to image, really have become much more detailed, much more wanting it to look like their vision of it. Whereas in the era before that, a lot of times you get layouts and you'd go from there. I mean, I think John Buscema is one of the best artists of all time, but a lot of the stuff that John did in 70s and 80s were really just layouts, and the inker would have to go in there and add the shading, add the lighting, everything. Whereas the guys in the post-image era sort of they think they're sort of penciling it with inking with their pencil. Basically, they're trying to add every bit of detail on it, and they want the inker to basically just translate it into ink, which I don't know if it's the best thing in the world. Actually, I've always disputed that it would be, because I think a lot of the pencilers have sort of put themselves in a box with that, where they can only, again, some of the best pencilers ever, Frank Miller or John Byrne or Gil Kane, they were doing 2 and 3 books a month. Most of these guys these days can barely get a book done every 2 months now, because they're putting so much effort into making every single line perfect. And I don't know if that's really necessary. I mean, if you have, to my mind, some of the best art in comic books is when you get a penciler that's very good at what he does and an inker that's very good at what he does. And then when they work together, it's almost like a third different artist comes out of it. It's like Jack Kirby's great. Jack Kirby and Joe Sinnott is greater, or it was Wally Wood. It's like, and they all look different too, but if it's a good inker, they'll equally valid, So I think a lot of the pencilers have sort of boxed themselves into that thing where it's a problem now. So yeah, I mean, I talk to them because like I said, you want them to look like what they're envisioning at the end of the day.
Have you had the opportunity to do any of that sort of finishing type art where it is just kind of layouts and you're, doing a little more
Yeah,
shaping of the
I have a
illustration?
few times, but it's just there's not as many opportunities to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And one of the jobs that I really wish I had was able to take, I had gotten a opportunity to ink. I think it was one of John Buscema's last jobs. It was a Galactus miniseries, and I really wanted to do it because I said he's one of my favorites, but I just couldn't. I was working on the X-Men book at the time, and it wasn't time effective to do both. It wasn't going to happen. But the pencils that you were getting from John at that point, like I said, were loose layouts. So that would have been a job where I would be able to go crazy on it and see
Yeah.
what happened. I think it ended up going to Bill Sienkiewicz, who obviously did a better job than I would have done anyway. But it would have been interesting to see, what it would have come out like, looking
Not
like at least.
not better necessarily, just different.
Yeah. He's good. He's good.
He is good. I'll give him and you that. So to that point, and trying to serve the penciler or meet them where they're at, would you say that you or any inker has a style? And if so, how would you describe that?
Yeah, certainly. I think, like I said, there were more. There was more of a stylistic thing flourish back when stuff was more loosely penciled. Like,
Yeah,
my favorite inker of all time is Klaus Janson, who I ink nothing like. But some of the choices that he makes, super bold lines and heavy rendering and heavy shadows. He's great, and he inks completely different than Terry Austin, say, who is super linear, which is more what my style probably leans toward. It's super tight, super linear, building up a bunch of lines to make a shadow as opposed to putting a big dark shadow down there. So yeah, there's a million different ways to do it. I mean, these days it's not as easy to see the differences because, like I said, the pencils are kind of dictating more what they want it to look like, so it kind of flattens it out to, you know, if someone's inking a Ryan Stegman, it's going to look like Ryan Stegman's pencil no matter what, with the
yeah,
sheen over it. Whereas opposed to maybe 20 years ago, if Ryan Stegman got inked by Klaus or Joe Rubinstein or something, it would look a little bit different, you know.
yeah. That makes sense. So going back to sort of the arc of your career, and you had this 6 month period where you were, a little bit in the what would you call it, the shallows, I
Unemployed,
guess.
unemployed.
Yeah, we could just directly call it unemployed. And you're coming out of it, and you're doing, these contests. You're getting your portfolio together. You're starting getting gigs at Image and things like that. Did you find that there was a point during all of that where you really started hitting your stride and you felt like fully comfortable and immersed in this, comic book world?
Yeah, it was pretty much early on with the X Force thing because once I got on it, I just didn't leave really. I just kind of stayed. I started on number 49, and there were some couple issues I missed here and there, but I stayed till number 100. So it's like 4 years, pretty much. So I mean, and once the first penciler Adam left, they wanted to keep me on with the next guy who was a young Jimmy Chung, who's great.
Yeah.
And the editor was like, "Yeah, it's your book. Whoever's the pencil, you're staying on it." So I was like, "Okay." Makes you feel good about it.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like sometimes, maybe a lot of times when you're on a big run, the inker is kind of maybe continuity
Yeah,
person.
certainly back then. I mean, I think the editor at the same was with Bobby Chase, so I think you guys have interviewed before.
Yeah.
Bobby's great, and she's like, the trains are running, so why are we changing the conductor at this point? Let's keep it moving. And they knew I would get the stuff in on time, and they just kept it going with the new guy, Jimmy Chung, at that point, who one of my best friends, but not the greatest with deadlines, so I need somebody to keep it moving.
Yeah. Well, speaking of those collaborations, and not to put you on the spot if you don't want to, if you don't want to highlight anybody in particular, but uh, who, what are some of your favorite collaborations from the past in terms of, who do you like to ink? You
Who do I
don't
hate?
have to ever, yeah. Well, I don't want to ask who do you hate, but I know sometimes people are a little reticent to not name everybody, for fear of saying, well, everybody's great to work with, but
No, that's not true at all.
so we'll just
Yeah, I
ask
mean,
for the positive.
I've
Like,
been on
what
books
are
where
the,
the guy's actively trying to get me fired. So yeah, it's not
okay.
great.
So not that person then would not fit in this category, but like who would you sort of drop everything for?
I've been exceedingly lucky with the people I've worked with. Like I said, starting with Adam Polina, who's great. Jimmy Chung, we've worked on X Force, and then he went off to CrossGen. I did a thing with him there. Came back to Marvel, and we've worked on and off together for over 25 years now. And even at the DC, we did the Justice League for a bit. But he's amazing. I got to work with when he came over from CrossGen. I got to work with Steve McNiven at the beginning of his Marvel career on Marvel Knights 4 and then New Avengers. Amazing. I got to work with maybe possibly the best penciler out there right now, Olivier Coipel, on Thor and Siege and a bunch of Adventures of X-Men. I got to do some of the Frank Quietly New X-Men run. I've worked with Ed McGuinness over the last few years. He's amazing. So yeah, I've had a really good bunch of runs going on there over the last few years. So it's hard to pick one, really.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I wasn't even looking for one, but you gave a really good group. What makes those collaborations special? Is it just literally the art that's coming through to your desk that you're sort of like surprised and excited or even challenged by? Or is it
Yeah,
something else?
it's well, I'm one of the inkers that I always get the script before so I can see what I'm in for, really, because the best part of writing comics is that it takes you the same amount of time to write two guys are in a bar, or the next sentence is 10,000 guys are fighting. It takes you the same time to write it. To draw it's a whole different animal. So you want to see what you're in for when the pages come in. And yeah, when you get a package of pages from Olivier or Jimmy Chung, it's magic because, like I said, it's I think one of the hardest jobs in art is to do it and do it well. So like I did the guy I forgot to mention, Neil Francis Yu. We did some X-Men together, and we did Secret Invasion together. And Secret Invasion, if you've read the story, is basically just the war on Earth and all the Skrulls coming down, fighting all the heroes. So at one point, I think in the seventh or eighth issue, there's a double page spread where everybody's fighting at Central Park, and I counted them. There's 750 people on that page, double page spread, 750. So it's like when you get that in the mail and you look at the page, it's like, wow, that's great, and then you realize, oh no, I have to do this. So yeah, it's there's a bit of magic about it, at times still. And like I said, most of the guys I've mentioned, I've really sort of become friendly with over the years, and good friends with. So, it's like you're working with a friend on a collaborative thing that people are going to see. So it's fun.
So besides collaborators, I'd love to know, are there particular, we talked about, well, you talked about X-Men and, the characters of your youth being sort of your favorites or the ones that you wanted to work on. What about like scenes or situations? Are you, like anybody would be, are you more psyched for, big fight and action scenes? Are there, big sort of widescreen kind of things that you like? Is there anything that jazzes you, or you just, as long as you're working with a great artist and on a good book, you're cool
Well,
with
the
all
great
that?
artist thing really does help.
Yeah.
And certainly it's more exciting to draw the guys in costume punching each other than people sitting on the subway or something. But even again, it depends on the artist, because you could take something as simple as a guy sitting on the subway, and if they have the right artist and they're inspired and it looks good, your job is to make it look pretty anyway. But yeah, it's certainly more fun to have Captain America punching somebody. Certainly, which is why like book crossover books like I said, Secret Invasion or Siege or Avengers vs. X-Men, where it's basically all the toys are punching each other. It's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine those are the more fun ones, especially because you get to work on so many different characters, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Although kind of a challenge when you look at a
It's
page like the one
you
you were
you
talking about.
right. I mean, that's when the deadline part of it becomes a thing where it's like it looks great, but how do you manage to get it done and meet the deadline? That's the thing.
Yeah. Um,
Which is one of the things really that is one of the more important parts of the job because the writer's almost definitely going to be late. The penciler is almost definitely going to be late, and then it's up to the inker, colorist, letterer to pull it out of the fire most times. So sometimes you have to speed it up to get it done, but you got to get it done.
yeah. And you don't get the accolades that
Yeah,
everybody else gets. It all sort of comes out in the wash once it comes out. Like no one knows
right.
what's happening behind the scene that you guys are swooping in
Yeah, but you don't
and
get to blame me either,
save.
though, because if it goes badly, I'm not blaming you. Really. So
That's true. All right, that's a good upside
the
there.
editor might blame you, but the public at large won't.
Always good to have the editor on your side.
Yes, yes.
Um, okay,
And
so
it's basically you're playing to the audience of one. That's the person right there.
yeah, yeah, no kidding. So what are maybe some of your, you mentioned a number of them already, but some of your proudest moments, like the books, the projects where you think it really just everything came together and knocked it out of the park.
Um, well, a lot of the export stuff I did at the beginning, I enjoyed doing it. I was in my first Marvel job, so of course I was enjoying doing it, and getting a paycheck's not bad. But it really
Helps.
wasn't the best X Force run. I think story wise, it was sort of they were on like a road trip across the country, kind of out of costume, getting into like everyday adventures, which it was fine, but
Yeah.
didn't really. It wasn't like X Force when it first started. When when Rob Liefeld was doing, which is like page after page of people punching each other
Yeah.
with pouches and stuff. So
Were
yeah,
you on
that was
with Capullo?
no. I
Or was
started
that your
after
post
Capullo. Yeah, it
after
was right
Capullo? Yeah.
after Capullo and Tony
Yeah.
Daniel. So it
Oh
was
yeah,
like
yeah. Okay.
they went for a whole. I guess they figured the first 50 issues was all action, so let's take the next 20 issues no action, which really wasn't the greatest thing. Well
Yeah.
written, but not what you're there for an X-Men book for.
Yeah.
And then I worked on the X-Men with Leo Francis Yu for a bit, and I don't know, was kind of a weird. I mean, my runs on X-Men have been weird. It's like never been the best stories at the same time. So, I mean, I ended up working, like I said, a little bit on the Grant Morrison, Frank Quitely X-Men, which is really good, but that was only like for a few issues. So X-Men has sort of been the elusive one for me, even though it's one of my favorite books.
Yeah.
I guess the first thing that I worked on that I really sort of liked a lot was worked with Stephen McNiven on Marvel Knights 4, which was sort of it was more of a slice of life thing with the Fantastic Four. It was written by Roberto Sacasa, who ended up going to be the showrunner for Riverdale of all things on
Oh
WB,
yeah, that's right.
and he
Yeah.
ended up doing Afterlife with Archie. Great writer, but so it was like a different take on the Fantastic Four with the more like everyday problems. But it was really well done, and Steve's an amazing artist, so that was fun. But I think the first real main one that think was memorable was Thor with Olivier Coipel and J. Michael Straczynski. It's like Thor, I guess, had been dead for about 3 or 4 years in the Marvel universe. So this is the one thing where they brought him back, and it was sort of kind of like a Neil Gaiman Vertigo thing for the first few issues. They didn't really have too much. It wasn't like a big fighting thing. It was like sort of building up, and then when it finally got to the explosive fighting, it was Jack Kirby esque. It was great. And Olivier, like I said, I think he's possibly the best artist in comics when he's doing it. I mean, and he's certainly him and Stuart Immonen are probably the two most influential ones of the last 15, 20 years because pretty much any artist that comes out now is drawing from them in some way, shape, or form. And
Right.
Olivier, the genius of his stuff is that he has the American comics, Jack Kirby, John Buscema thing to it, but he's also an animator and he's from Europe. So he has like a different approach to it. So it's like a weird combination that just comes out beautifully. So getting pages from him, that is like magic. I mean, every page was like, wow, just, how does a person's mind think this way to draw this way?
Yeah.
So that was fun. We also did Siege, which was just like a big fight comic book for 4 issues, which was great. Um, and some Avengers versus X-Men, which is fun too. And there's a Lineal Use, another great one, because Secret Invasion was, like I said, thousands and thousands of characters, and somehow we got it out on time every month, which I still don't know. I don't think I could do it now. Back then, I was young and energetic, I guess. Um, but yeah, it was like the little. I mean, it was the equivalent of doing like Crisis on Infinite Earths back in the 80s, I guess. It's just like a cast of millions in there. So to get to do that with all the Marvel characters, literally all of them, and like 70s versions of them, was great. So yeah, like I said, I've had some good runs on stuff. I guess most recently would be like the Spider-Man Deadpool run I did with Ed McGuinness. I'm not the biggest Deadpool fan, but Ed draws him so well, and he's taken off. And the Spider-Man is, I think, going to be remembered as one of the better ones they've been, because he's doing a great job with the book right now.
Yeah, I definitely love Ed McGuinness. I love all of the artists you've mentioned, and we did have Laniel on, Francis
Yes,
Yu.
I've heard that one.
And I asked him, and I'm just curious. I know they couldn't do it with the cast of thousands like you did in the comic book, but I was so disappointed that Secret Invasion just did not have the scope that the comic book had.
Yeah.
I mean, again, you would have to pay for the likenesses and the actors of everybody to be Skrulls, but
the only way I think they could have done that is that they would have to have been building it through the movies for a while, like they did with Thanos, multiple movies. And because I saw the first 2 episodes and I was like, yeah, they kind of missed it on this one. It's not quite what I'm looking for here.
I mean, they basically took the title from the comic and did their own whole thing. But I wish they could do maybe like one of those animated movies, Like DC does that really well, I have to say, is that they, when they have their, Marvel, not Marvel, their cinematic universe, but they also have this animated wing that kind of does comic book stories and storylines.
Right, and it's the weirdest thing, because for the longest time, Marvel movies have been good and their animation has been questionable, whereas DC, the movies have been questionable, but the animation has been great. So, but hopefully Marvel's picking it up now, because the X-Men 97 thing was well done, and they're doing some other stuff now that hopefully will take off, and hopefully the DC movies get better. So
for sure. Have you ever had like from I guess you had a bad experience in your first animation, but have you ever thought about storyboarding or animation, getting back into that?
I've been so lucky doing this, where I've really, other than a couple of weeks here, a couple of months there, I've been doing this for over 30 years now. I have almost never been really looking for work. So it's knocking on wood. And but yeah, it's never been a problem really finding the jobs, with Marvel, I was like under contract for them for 15 years or something. So it was never like really an issue getting anything from them. And then when I left the contract, it was really just because I wanted to, DC had been asking me to do stuff for a while and whatnot. So I got out of there, and then I ended up doing Invincible with Ryan Ollie, the last run of that, which he's another guy I forget. He's amazing too, obviously. And then they did some DC stuff. So it was just sort of trying to not just keep doing the same Marvel stuff over and over again. But yeah, I know how it is for most freelancers, that you're really begging for work sometimes. But I've been really lucky to not be looking too often. So yeah, I've never had much time to really have free time to do anything else, really.
Okay, no worries about that. I mean,
I'm not complaining.
You're hitting on all cylinders. You're getting to work. So why mess with a good thing?
It's working out. As I'm getting older, I want to do some other stuff. But yeah, it's
sure.
I've had a good run.
Yeah. Well, before we get into your current and future projects, kind of a last summary question, I guess, which is, you just made reference to it, is that you've been in the industry 30 plus years. What are
Such a long
yeah, I
time.
know you're sort of like, yeah, taking stock, but if you do take stock and take a step back, like what have you learned about your craft and the comic book world in general that in these 30 years that I don't know, you can give to somebody who's just starting out?
I think it's still amazingly after all because let me see, reading been working 30 years, but then reading them for 50 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I still love it. Still great. I mean, I don't go to the comic book store as much as I used to because the one near me kind of closed during COVID. So, but I mean, before that, it was like an unbroken string of like 35 years of going to the comic book store every Wednesday to pick up, to at least look at the new books coming out. And I still, despite some of the repetitiveness of it, I still love looking at it. I still love reading them. I still love collecting them. I've gotten into, unfortunately, collecting original art, which is time consuming and expensive. And I should have started maybe 20 years ago. Um,
Heard that
but
story
yeah,
before.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I could just tell you stories about stuff I could have bought for so much less that are running for like 10 times the amount now, which is, it hurts my brain. I have to build a time machine. But yeah, I've enjoyed my career immensely. I mean, to get to work on, like I was saying before, when I picked up the comic books as a kid, and it was like, you're reading a puzzle piece of a part of a larger tapestry. The fact that I've been able to actually contribute to part of that big puzzle, it's great.
Yeah.
I mean, what more could you want, really?
Yeah. And we're back. Hey, everybody, check out Mark's new crowdfunding campaign on Zoop. It's called The Magical. So it's a new story, creator owned. I think you're going to love it. We have the link in the notes, but definitely want to support Mark. Great guy, had a great conversation. Really appreciate him coming on and would love to have him again sometime. But that'll do it for this episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Also, remember in these waning days to vote for us in the first few categories in cbcawards.org. Just check it out. Go to the website and throw Dollar Bin Bandits a couple votes. But we will conclude for today. You got another episode on Friday. How'd you like that Just Joe week last week? Great job, Joe. Oren, fantastic job on Monday's episode, and he's going to be the Friday episode. So you got all three of us, at some point. Thank you, and we'll see you next issue.